22:01 hours. March 24, 1944. North Compound, Stalag Luft III, near Sagan, Germany. The snow on the parade ground had frozen into a thin, glassy crust. Floodlights washed the wire in harsh white. In Guard Tower 7, a German sentry leaned on an MG-34 machine gun, its 7.92 by 57 mm belt hanging in a loose curve, barrel pointed lazily at the shadowed huts below. 20 meters away, in the shadows behind Hut 104, Flight Lieutenant Jack Ramsay, age 27, Royal Air Force bomber navigator, knelt over a square of frozen earth that should not exist. The trapdoor. He wore a faded RAF greatcoat over woolen long johns, 2 shirts, and a pullover. Even so, the Silesian cold cut through him. He pulled off his mitten and pressed bare fingers to the timber frame, feeling for the wire that would lift the lid. The wood was made from bed slats, each board once part of a prisoner's bunk. Now they framed the entrance to a tunnel that almost no German in this camp believed could exist. Behind him, a line of men in greatcoats and mismatched caps waited in silence. Each carried a small bag, a forged identity card, a paper travel pass. The tunnel's code name was Harry. Tonight, Harry would open. At 22:03, Jack glanced at his watch, an RAF-issue mechanical he'd bought in London in 1941. The luminous hands glowed faintly green. He slid the trapdoor aside. A breath of damp, cold air rose from below. A faint glimmer of electric light leaked up from the shaft, their stolen wiring tapping into the camp's power grid. He swung his legs into the square. For a second, the weight of the last 2 years pressed on him. September 4, 1942, 31,000 feet over Essen, pinned in the nose of a Handley Page Halifax bomber, dodging cone after cone of German searchlights. Flak detonations had rocked the aircraft, black puffs throwing shrapnel at 600 meters per second into thin aluminum skins. A shell fragment had torn through the wing, fuel gushing, fire licking at the spar. At 1:17 that night, they'd bailed out over western Germany. Jack's parachute, standard RAF 41 pattern, silk canopy, 24 feet in diameter, opened at roughly 12,000 feet. It carried him down past the sharp silhouettes of pine trees. He'd landed hard in a field, one ankle screaming as ligaments tore. Within 30 minutes, a local patrol had him at rifle point. By 10:30 the next morning, he was in the back of a Luftwaffe truck, heading east. By 1500 hours 2 days later, the truck stopped at a new camp in the forest, around 160 kilometers southeast of Berlin. The sign read, Stalag Luft III. The Germans had built it specifically to stop men like him from escaping. The camp's wire ran in 3 belts, each around 2.5 meters high, with barbed strands curled like brambles across the top. Beyond the wire, 10 meters of no man's land sat under floodlights, watched by guard towers at each corner and midway sections. The sandy soil was deliberately chosen. Any tunnel dug through it would leave a telltale depression as it settled. On that first day, at 16:42, as he limped through the main gate with 30 other captured aircrew, Jack had made a quiet calculation. The distance from the nearest hut to the inner wire looked like 30 meters. From there to the far side of the sentry track, maybe another 10. With sand that flowed like water and guards with dogs, a tunnel would need to be at least 8 or 9 meters deep to avoid detection. It seemed almost impossible. Almost. By 1710, he was standing in front of a tall man with a heavy jaw and a faint South African accent, squadron leader Roger Bushell of the RAF, the man the camp knew simply as Big X. Bushell's eyes had scanned Jack's file. Bomber Command. Navigation. Some university engineering before the war. Bushell had looked up, measuring him. You any good with numbers, Ramsay? Jack had nodded. Then you're not just a prisoner, Bushell had said. You're staff. Now, in March 1944, those numbers had become reality. At 22:05, Jack lowered himself into the shaft. The tunnel dropped vertically for about 9 meters. A rough wooden ladder, again made from bed slats, led down into darkness. Hard-packed sand scratched his boots. He descended slowly, counting each rung. At the bottom, he stepped into a space barely wider than his shoulders. The tunnel's main passage was about 60 centimeters square, shored with timber, the boards creaking under stress. Electric bulbs, stripped from unused buildings, hung from twisted wire, throwing pools of yellow light every few meters. A small wooden trolley sat on narrow tracks made from bed braces, ready to carry sand back to the shaft. At 22:07, the first of tonight's passengers dropped in behind him. The plan, drafted in detail over months, aimed to move 200 men through Harry and out into the forest beyond the wire. They would trickle into the tunnel in a strict order, each man timed, each group assigned a route, a cover story, and a forged identity. Jack was not on the escape list. He was tunnel staff tonight, a controller underground, responsible for keeping the flow moving, clearing sand, and watching for signs of collapse. If everything went perfectly, he would still be in Stalag Luft III when the last man emerged into the forest. He knew it would not go perfectly. At 22:10 he crouched, placed a hand on the tunnel wall, and felt the faint vibration of men already moving ahead toward the exit shaft. Somewhere above, the MG-34 in Tower 7 sat primed, its 50-round drum loaded, the gunner bored and half asleep. Between Jack and that gun lay roughly 102 meters of painstakingly dug tunnel, a layer of frozen earth, and a few inches of snow. He took a breath, and the story of how a camp built to be escape-proof became the scene of the most audacious prison break of the Second World War played through his mind in hard, detailed fragments. To understand that night, the story had to rewind to the autumn of 1942, when Jack was still new to the compound and the war seemed balanced on a knife's edge. On October 12, 1942, at 19:30, Bushell gathered a small group of officers in a dim corner of Hut 104. The hut measured roughly 40 meters by 10, long wooden walls, narrow beds, and a central stove. The men sat on slat stools and crates, mugs of ersatz coffee in their hands. The plan Bushell outlined was not modest. He wanted 3 tunnels. Not one which the Germans expected, but 3, Tom, Dick, and Harry, angled toward different parts of the perimeter. If the guards found one, the other 2 would continue. His target was staggering, 200 men out in one coordinated breakout. At 1952, Jack listened while the job assignments rolled out. The X organization, as Bushell called it, would function like a small military staff. Intelligence would gather maps, railway schedules, and observe guard routines. Forgery would turn Red Cross parcel cardboard and stolen ink into passes, work permits, and identity papers. Tailoring would turn blankets and odd bits of uniform into civilian clothes that looked vaguely Polish, Czech, or French. Security would run lookouts and warning systems against sudden German searches, Gehen durch, when guards swept through the huts. Jack's assignment was engineering. On October 20, 1942, at 7:40, the first exploratory shaft for Tom opened in a small locked room beneath a stove in Hut 123 in the east compound. The stove's base plate slid aside, revealing a square barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. The engineers measured. They would need to go down at least 9 meters to get below the warning microphones the Germans had buried in the soil to catch the sound of digging. They worked with handmade tools, table knives with sharpened edges, pieces of broken shovel, and a few real entrenching tools stolen from work parties outside the wire. Every stroke had to be muffled. The sand, a fine yellow subsoil, flowed like powder. Without shoring, the shaft would collapse. By November 3, at 11:15, Jack and another officer, a Canadian miner named Wally, were working in 4-hour shifts. They installed wooden frames every half meter, each frame made from 3 or 4 bed slats nailed together. Each slat measured around 6 centimeters wide, 2 thick, 1.8 meters long. Over 4,000 slats would eventually vanish from camp bunks. Prisoners slept on sagging wires and straw, laughing away back pain as a small contribution to the war effort. Spoil, the sand from the tunnel, became the engineering department's second problem. By November 19, the shaft for Tom was down 9 meters and the horizontal digging began. Every meter advanced produced almost a cubic meter of sand, weighing over a metric ton after moisture. They could not simply dump it. The German guards tracked every disturbance in the compound. At 14:22 that day, Jack tested a new method. He wore a bag made from old socks inside each trouser leg, tied with string at the bottom. Another prisoner walked in front of him as they strolled around the compound. At 14:25, with a discreet tug on the string, sand trickled out and scattered into the loose topsoil. Dozens of men would repeat that action hundreds of times, the so-called penguins, waddling awkwardly as they distributed the tunnel's guts across the camp. Through the winter of 1942 to 43, Tom stretched steadily toward the east wire. On January 9, 1943, at 2:05, a minor collapse trapped a digger 12 meters from the shaft. Jack, working as shift lead that night, crawled forward, pushing a small trolley, essentially a wooden box mounted on tiny wheels running on rails, and dug him out with his hands, scooping sand in claustrophobic darkness. The tunnel roof sagged within centimeters of his face. The air felt thick, the candle flame guttering. They realized then they needed a proper airflow. By January 17th, the engineers had built a crude but effective air pump, modeled on a bellows. They used wooden boards, rubber from inner tubes, and canvas from kit bags. A rhythm emerged, 2 men at the pump, driving fresh air through tin cans hammered into a pipe, supplying oxygen to the far end of the tunnel. Without it, a man working with a pick could pass out in minutes. All the while, the broader war moved in the background like distant thunder. On February 2, 1943, rumors filtered in of a German surrender at Stalingrad. By March 1, news of heavy fighting in Tunisia reached the camp. The prisoners tracked the front line with stubby pencils on wall maps, but their war was measured in centimeters of sand, not kilometers of ground. The second tunnel, Dick, began in November as well, its shaft hidden under a shower drain in the washroom. Dick's route angled toward a wooded area near the east compound fence. Harry III started later, in January 1943, its entrance under a stove in Hut 104, Jack's hut. At 18:30 on February 10, 1943, in a cramped meeting in the hut, they laid out the 3 routes on hand-drawn plans. Tom would be longest, perhaps 110 meters. Dick would be shorter, maybe 90. Harry would be around 102, aimed at a thick stand of trees beyond the northern wire. Jack sketched cross-sections, calculating timber usage and the stress loads in sand at that depth. By May 1943, Tom had passed the halfway mark. On the 8th at 9:17, a goon-baiting incident, prisoners distracting guards with theatrics in one part of the compound, allowed diggers to bring up an extra shift of spoil. Production increased. The engineering team installed an electric lighting system, using scavenged cable and fittings, tied into the camp's main supply with improvised connectors. Where once candles sputtered, 40-watt bulbs now gave off a steady glow. Every addition brought risk. A flicker on the camp's power line could be noticed. Missing bed slats could trigger a search. Security worked overtime. Stooge lookouts were posted at strategic corners inside the huts. A system of signals, coughs, shouted greetings, even specific lines from songs, would warn of approaching guards. On June 11, 1943, at 16:03, those warnings failed. A German guard, suspicious of a group of prisoners congregating near Hut 123, ordered an inspection. Within minutes, a full search was underway. By 1640, a dog team was in the hut. At 1652, a boot struck the hollow base of the stove. The plate came up. A shaft yawned below. Tom was blown. The Germans reacted with predictable fury. They sealed the shaft with concrete, added more microphones, and tightened restrictions. For the prisoners, months of work vanished in less than an hour. Some men stared at the filled shaft as if at a grave. For Jack, the loss of Tom narrowed the problem but did not change the equation. At 18:15 that evening, in a low-voiced meeting, the X-organization decided Dick would be turned into a storage dump for forged documents and equipment. Harry would become the main escape route. All resources, timber, men, time, shifted to that single line of attack. From that point on, Jack's life was measured in shifts down Harry, lungs full of dust, hands raw, mind calculating how far a man could crawl in a space barely big enough to breathe, and whether 200 of them could really reach the trees before dawn. By the start of 1944, Harry had become a parallel universe under Stalag Luft III. On January 4, 1944, at 7:10, roll call appel snapped the prisoners into their daily routine. Hundreds of men formed up in rows facing the main gate. Snow squeaked under boots. German NCOs counted heads while officers watched from the sidelines, collars turned up against the cold. Above ground, life in the camp followed a pattern: roll call, thin breakfast, chores, lectures, card games, and letters from home. Below ground, a different clock ticked. At 9:40 that same morning, Jack descended into Harry for an engineering inspection. The tunnel now stretched around 100 meters, its roof and walls lined with timber, floor fitted with wooden planks to keep knees out of the wet sand. In places, the tunnel curved slightly, following shallow calculations intended to minimize stress zones in the soil. The team had added a trolley system. At 10:03, Jack watched as a digger at the face loaded sand into a wooden box around 80 centimeters long, 40 wide. He tugged twice on a cord. 2 men back toward the shaft pulled, the box rattling along rails made from bed braces. At full speed, they could move nearly a cubic meter of sand in minutes. At 12:20, they gathered in a cramped chamber near the shaft, a widened section of tunnel used as a meeting point. Bushell set out the new timeline. The escape would take place as soon as the tunnel reached the tree line, and final preparations, forged documents, clothes and rations were ready. His target date, sometime in March. By February 10, 1944, the logistics chain for 200 men looked like a small army on paper. Each man would need at least one forged identity document, often a work permit in a foreign worker's name. Food for several days, bread, margarine, perhaps sausage or powdered milk, hoarded from Red Cross parcels. A set of civilian-style clothes, jackets dyed with boot polish, caps cut from blankets, boots doctored to look less military. A route plan. Some would aim for railway lines and try to blend into crowds at stations. Others, especially those with good German, would travel by train toward the border. Non-German speakers might try to reach neutral Sweden or Switzerland via underground contacts. The forgery factory operated in a hidden room between 2 huts. On February 18 at 21:37, Jack stepped through a false wall panel into a space lit by a single lamp. Inside, men hunched over tables. A former commercial artist hand-lettered documents, copying official fonts with painstaking care. Another man, a pre-war printer, had built a crude hand press to stamp seals. Ink came from burnt rubber mixed with water and glue. Blotting paper came from parcel wrappings. Every scrap mattered. Security tension rose with each passing week. On March 5, 1944, at 10:28, a surprise Gehendurch swept the north compound. Guards with bayonets and dogs stormed into huts. Prisoners casually blocked paths, dropped books, or accidentally spilled soup to slow them down. Jack, posted as a stooge outside the entrance to Harry under the stove in Hut 104, leaned in the doorway and launched into a loud argument with a friend, drawing an NCO's attention away from the stove by sheer volume. The search missed the tunnel by less than 2 meters. By March 20, the head of Harry finally punched into a small chamber just short of the forest beyond the wire. At 16:40 that day, a digger broke through and felt cold air rush in. When Jack crawled out to inspect at 17:05, he realized the bad news. The exit emerged short of the tree line, in open ground beyond the last fence but before real cover. The distance to the nearest tree was around 8 to 10 meters, a killing zone if a searchlight hit at the wrong moment. They could not extend the tunnel any farther. The soil and time would not allow it. The plan adjusted, not abandoned. The first men out would carry ropes and guides, helping those behind cross the open patch quickly and silently. Each escapee would have to choose his moment, timing his dash between sweeps of the tower lights. That brought them back to March 24, 1944. At 20:15, 2 hours before the opening, Jack sat on his bunk, tightening the laces of his boots. He checked the small notebook in his pocket, a matrix of timings and flow estimates underground. They calculated they could push 1 man through every minute or 2, assuming no jams, collapses, or injuries. Over the course of the night, that should allow around 200 men to pass. In theory. At 2100 hours, the first group of escapees slipped into Hut 104, ostensibly to join a theater rehearsal. Inside, ex-organization staff moved them in small clusters to the trapdoor under the stove. At 21:45, Jack moved to his position near the shaft in the tunnel, one of several controllers. At 22:10, as he steadied himself against the tunnel wall and listened to the vibrations of movement ahead, the first man, a Pole with excellent German, reached the exit chamber. At 22:18, he slid back the small hatch and poked his head into freezing air. The plan collided with reality. Snow and frost made the ground crunch underfoot. The forest edge loomed farther than expected, a gray line in the dark. Worst of all, an unexpected guard patrol passed closer to the area than usual. The escapee froze, half out of the tunnel, then backed down, reporting to the controller at the head that they would have to be even more careful and slower than their already cautious schedule. The bottleneck began. By 2300 hours, the line of men underground had barely advanced. Jack's notebook estimates dissolved into the simple job of keeping order and morale up. He whispered timing corrections, urged men forward to squeeze closer, checked that no one was panicking. The tunnel air grew stale despite the pump. Sweat froze on faces. At 0:17, the first escapee finally crawled out, belly flat on the snow, and dragged himself toward the dark trees. A second followed 3 minutes later. The pace improved, but never reached the ideal. Every delay at the exit rolled backward, compressing the line. At 1:30, Harry had moved out barely a few dozen men. Above ground, the night deepened. In the distance, trains clanked along the Silesian lines, lives of ordinary Germans continuing while, beneath a prisoner-of-war camp, dozens of Allied officers tried to vanish into the darkness. At 3:50, the 76th man slipped out of the tunnel and moved toward the trees. In the shaft behind him, men still waited, shoulders pressed into sand, documents and hopes clutched to their chests. At 4:55, a guard in Tower 7 noticed movement near the fence, a patch of disturbed snow, a faint depression in the frost where men had vanished. He called it in. A patrol moved out. At 5 o'clock, a sentry nearly broke his ankle stepping into a soft spot in the ground. His boot punched through the thin crust and into empty space. The tunnel's exit. Within minutes, flares arced into the sky, bathing the forest edge in harsh white. Sirens wailed. Guards poured into the compound, shouting, slamming rifle bolts home. In the tunnel, Jack felt the vibration change. More footsteps, faster, angrier. A shout ran down the line from the shaft. Back! Back! It's blown. At 5:07, he and the men around him began the painful process of reverse crawling, backing up toward the shaft in line, one by one, breathing ragged, half-blinded as lights went out. The Great Escape, in practical terms, was over. 76 men had made it out of the wire. For Jack, still underground in Harry, the most dangerous part of his war had just shifted from digging sand to surviving what would come next. By 6:30 on March 25, 1944, Harry was no longer a secret. German engineers and soldiers stood at the shaft under Hut 104, staring down in disbelief at the tunnel's tidy timbering and electric lights. The camp commandant, Oberst von Lindiner, a professional officer in his 50s, looked less angry than stunned. At 7:05, Jack and dozens of other prisoners stood on the parade ground in thin clothing, ringed by guards with rifles and submachine guns. The MG-34S in the towers now pointed directly into the compound, not lazily over it. The temperature sat just below freezing. Breath steamed in clouds. German officers shouted questions. Who planned it? Who dug? Where were the others going? No one answered. Over the next 48 hours, the Wehrmacht and Gestapo unleashed a vast manhunt. Police units, SA auxiliaries, and Hitler Youth combed woods and train stations across Germany and occupied Europe. Roadblocks went up. Trains were checked. For the escapees, any mistake, an accent wrong, a ticket misread, a suitcase handled clumsily, could be the difference between freedom and a pistol at the side of the road. Some nearly made it. 2 Norwegians and a Dutchman, experts on the rail network, reached neutral Sweden by ship. Another group got as far as near the Swiss border. Many others were caught within hours, still close to Sagan, soaked and shivering in ditches or barns. Back in Stalag Luft III, Jack watched the numbers change. On March 30th, 1944, at 9 o'clock, the Germans announced that most of the escapees had been recaptured. Officially, they were to be returned to the camp. Rumors spread among the prisoners, rumors of shootings, of shot while resisting, of men simply vanishing in the hands of the Gestapo. In early April, the truth began to leak. 50 of the 76 had been executed on Hitler's orders, murdered in small groups on lonely roads and in forests, their deaths disguised as attempts to escape. Bushel himself, the architect of the tunnels, was among them. On April 8, 1944, at 1600 hours, the camp assembled for a memorial service. Prisoners stood in ranks, bareheaded, while a chaplain read the names. Jack listened as they echoed across the compound. Friends, shift partners, men he had argued with over shovel schedules and air pump settings. He felt no pride that day, only a hard, cold anger. Still, even in the face of mass murder, the logic of the escape held. The Geneva Conventions were clear. Allied officers were required to try to escape, to be a continuing burden on the enemy. The tunnels had tied up thousands of German policemen and soldiers for weeks. They had forced the Nazis to divert resources in the middle of a losing war. But the cost had been written in blood. Through the summer and autumn of 1944, the war tilted decisively. On June 6, Allied forces landed in Normandy. By August, Paris was liberated. In January 1945, the Red Army broke through in the east and began to roll westward. Stalag Luft III suddenly lay in the path of two converging offensives. On January 27, 1945, at 2200 hours, with Soviet artillery audible in the distance, orders came down: the camp would be evacuated. In temperatures dropping to -20°C, thousands of prisoners, including Jack, were marched out of Sagan on foot, dragging sledges or small carts loaded with their few possessions. The column stretched for kilometers along icy roads. Over several weeks, the long march carried them westward, shuffled between camps as the collapsing Third Reich tried to hang on. Men dropped from exhaustion, frostbite, and disease. Jack walked with a piece of broken broom handle as a makeshift cane, his old parachute ankle injury flaring with every step. On April 29, 1945, at around 1400 hours, American forces liberated the camp where Jack and many others had finally ended up, near Moosburg in Bavaria. The gate, once a symbol of everything they had fought against, swung open. Prisoners stumbled out to meet GIs with cigarettes and chocolate, tanks idling in the background. Jack weighed barely 60 kilograms then, down from nearly 82 years earlier. His war as a prisoner was over. The consequences of the Great Escape, however, were just beginning. In the immediate post-war years, Allied investigators tracked down those responsible for the murders of the 50. British war crimes teams followed paper trails through the ruins of German police stations, interviewed witnesses, and interrogated former Gestapo officers. Trials were held. Some of the men who had calmly driven escapees to lonely woods and shot them in the back were hanged. Jack, still in the RAF at that time, found himself involved in a different way. On September 12, 1946, at 10:30, he sat in a small office in London, recounting his experiences in Stalag Luft III to an investigator with a tape recorder. He laid out the engineering work, the organization, the names of those who had played key roles. His testimony, like that of many others, helped historians and courts reconstruct exactly what had happened. In 1947, he left the RAF with the rank of flight lieutenant. The war had burned away his early ambitions to return to a quiet navigation job in civilian airlines. Instead, he studied civil engineering, using the same talent for soil mechanics and structural calculation that had kept Harry from collapsing. By the early 1950s, he was working on bridge foundations and tunnel supports in peacetime Europe, applying formal mathematics to problems he had first solved with stolen bed slats and cigarette tins. The war, however, never entirely left him. On March 24, 1964, exactly 20 years after the escape, Jack stood in a small ceremony at the site of the former camp, now in Polish territory. A monument had been erected to the 50 murdered officers. The pine trees had grown taller, and much of the wire was gone, but the outline of the north compound was still visible. Somewhere beneath the soil lay the remains of Harry, collapsed and filled, its timbers rotted away. He placed a wreath at the base of the memorial, fingers lingering on the carved names. In his jacket pocket lay a folded program from a recent film dramatization of the Great Escape. It was a good story, he admitted, but it had simplified, compressed, changed nationalities and details. Films needed heroes and tidy arcs. The reality had been less tidy, more technical, and more costly. Over the decades, his story and those of his comrades filtered into military academies and training manuals. Escape and evasion courses for pilots referenced Stalag Luft III as a case study in organization under captivity, how to build a clandestine structure, manage resources, and maintain morale under total control by the enemy. Engineers quietly admired the tunneling work, noting how men with almost no tools had built a 100-meter shaft system under one of the most heavily guarded prison camps of the war. They turned lessons about soil behavior, ventilation, and shoring into safer construction practices. For Jack, the legacy was simpler. He had been a prisoner of war, a number on a camp roll, an enemy flyer whose life and death should have meant very little to the regime that held him. Instead, armed with stolen knives, bed slats, and a refusal to accept the wire as permanent, he and his comrades had forced the Nazi state to notice them, to fear what they might do, even in chains. He had helped dig 3 tunnels with the intention of freeing 200 men. The plan did not unfold as they imagined. 2 tunnels were lost. 76 men made it out. 50 never returned. But the attempt itself, the precision, the courage, the engineering under pressure, became part of the larger story of resistance in a war defined by industrialized violence and mass captivity. Years later, when young officers asked him what it had really felt like, he did not talk first about fear, or sand, or the sound of boots on the Appellplatz. He talked about a moment at 2210 on March 24, 1944, his hand on the timber wall of a tunnel 9 meters underground, feeling the vibration of men moving toward a small square of darkness that meant either freedom or death, and knowing that, as long as they kept going, they were still fighting. In that cramped, airless space beneath Stalag Luft III, the wire above them was no longer a boundary. It was just a problem to be solved.